Good morning, everybody. Hi. Oh, thank you. Welcome. My name is Cait Miller, and I am a reference librarian in the music division here at the library. And today's Declassified. We're here to learn more about a woman named Rebecca Clarke, and specifically about her Viola Sonata that she wrote in 1919 for the Berkshire Festival, which was held by Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge, who I'll talk about more. Normally at our Declassified events, it's a really fun opportunity. Usually people sit actually on the stage and we bring the collection material out. I've done one in Whitall Pavilion before too. But today we were lucky enough to engage some really wonderful performers who were able to come, and they're going to perform the piece. So we thought, let's have everybody sit out in the audience. I'll make my Coolidge auditorium debut. Oh, no. Thank you. But I'm still bringing out the collection material as well, and you'll see the two tables on the stage. After the talk, after the performance, everybody is invited to come up and take a closer look. I should also say that the library does not hold the Rebecca Clarke collection, but we do have music manuscripts and letters in her hand because we hold another collection, that of Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge, who I just mentioned, and her foundation. You sit in Coolidge Auditorium, named for Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge, not for President Calvin Coolidge, which is one of my missions in life, to get that little factoid out there. And if you've been coming to our concert series for a long time, you probably know all about Mrs. Coolidge, but some people have never heard about her today. So we'll talk more about her and Rebecca Clarke and their relationship. Great, so I laid the groundwork for today. And I also hope to have a little Q&A session at the end too, so you all can ask your questions. But for starters, how many people really don't have a good sense of who Rebecca Clarke is walking in today? Wow, it's sad and it's great, because we're going to learn about her today. So, but it's not surprising, really. She's not a name that a lot of people know. So let's just start with a basic kind of who is Rebecca Clarke in a nutshell. And we'll start with her date. She's born in 1886. She died in 1979. So she lived through 2 world wars. And she was a successful violist who was a part of history in 1912 when she was hired to play professionally in a major orchestra in London. The Queen's Hall Orchestra. At this point in history, 1912, it's really rare to see women performing in major orchestras in London and the United States. So this is like a big deal, and she's making big waves. But she was also a composer. We're primarily celebrating her as a composer today, and focusing on her 1919 Viola Sonata that turns 100 years old this year, because it's 2019. But let's start with just a little overview of her life so that we feel more connected to her, more connected to the piece before we take a listen. Rebecca Clarke was born near London, England, and she had a German mother and an American father. She had 2 brothers. And they lived in an upper middle class family comfortably, though her father was controlling and abusive, but he was also a music enthusiast. And Rebecca started violin lessons when she was 8 years old, and was picking up on things noticeably quickly. So when she was about 13 years old, her father enrolled her at the Royal Academy of Music in London. And she did well there. She was supposed to stay there for 3 years until she was 16, but her father actually pulled her out of the Royal Academy right away after her harmony professor revealed that he wanted to marry her. So, eeks. So I don't know more about that. I don't know how she felt about that, but she left, which is probably a good thing. But while she was there, she did start to develop an interest in composition, which she herself noted was quite unusual for women at that time. After that, her father enrolls her at the Royal College of Music, and the Royal College was actually founded by an Irish composer, conductor, educator, Charles Villiers Stanford, who was really well established, well respected in the music world then. And not only was she admitted to the college to study performance, but he actually admitted her to his composition classes. And she was the only female student he took on. So I have a quote from her unpublished memoir where she remembers her time at the Royal College. And she says, quote, "I loved the Royal College and made many more friends there than I had at the Royal Academy. It was extremely stimulating to think of the well-known composers who had been there and passed through Stanford's hands: Gustav Holst, Vaughan Williams, Frank Bridge, George Butterworth, and a host of others, all of whom I ultimately came to know. That I was the only woman he had accepted was a source of great pride to me, though I knew full well that I never really deserved it," unquote. I'll let that hang there for a while. Not only did Stanford take her on for composition lessons, though, he is the one who actually suggested to Clarke that she switch from studying violin to studying the viola. And it was his advice to her that playing the viola would put her right in the middle of the sound so that she could tell how it's all done. So it would give her a different perspective in her composition work. And she decided to make that switch, and she ended up studying with the renowned violist Lionel Tertis at the Royal College. But as I said earlier, Clarke's father was difficult, he was abusive, they had a difficult relationship, and they fought quite a lot. And one day it was just one fight too many, and it took them to their breaking point, and he took her out of classes at the Royal College again, and kicked her out of the house. She decided to move to London on her own and take up, decided she was going to make a living for herself being a professional violist. And she had a whole network of colleagues and friends who helped her with gigs and played at parties, chamber ensembles. But then, as I said earlier, in 1912, it was Sir Henry Wood, the conductor, who hired her and 5 other women to play in the Queen's Hall Orchestra. So, yes, so making her one of the first women to make this big professional leap. Okay, so she continues to play with orchestras and chamber ensembles, and she tours as well. And she composed during this time mostly short instrumental pieces and songs. One interesting little story about her composition, or her career as a composer and a performer, happens in 1918. So I just want to tell it to kind of give some context for what it was like for Rebecca Clarke. So in 1918, she's 32 years old, and she played a recital in New York City with the cellist May Muckle, who was a really good friend of hers and a stellar cellist. They played a recital, and the program featured works by Bach and Lully, Brahms, some other contemporary male British composers, but it also featured 2 works by Rebecca Clarke herself. The program, however, for that recital only includes Rebecca's name once. The second work that she did is actually attributed to someone else. It's attributed to the name Anthony Trent. So here's what Clarke had to say about the program in her own words. She said, quote, "I played 2 groups of works, and in each group there was something that I'd written myself. As you know, there are awfully few solos for the viola, and I think I also played some duets. But anyways, I wanted rather to play another piece I had written, And I thought, this is too silly to put my name down still once more. It was too silly for her to include her name twice on one recital program. So I thought, I'll invent a name. So I thought about the rivers in England that I liked until I came across what I thought would be a handy surname. I took the name Trent, and I took the first name Anthony because I like that name. And this is one for Women's Lib. She says, because although the piece by Anthony Trent was not particularly good, it had much more attention paid to it than the piece I had written in my own name, which was rather a joke. Interesting, right? Okay. 1918, that same year, I'm going to move back to talking about the Berkshire festivals. That's the year of the first Berkshire Festival in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, sponsored by Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge, who is one of the great 20th century patrons of the arts and a very good friend of the library as well. When she came into a sizable inheritance, Mrs. Coolidge decided she wanted to dedicate a large portion of her money to the promotion of chamber music. Chamber music meant a lot to her from the time that she was a little girl. She was a concert pianist herself, and so she wanted to bring chamber music to as many people as possible. One of the ways she did this was starting this festival series, the Berkshire Festivals. So in 1918, she invites all of these musicians and composers from all over, America, but also Europe, to congregate, come together, and share music. So you have all of these composers and musicians from war-torn Europe coming to Pittsfield, Massachusetts in September of 1918, 2 months before the armistice, which is just kind of noteworthy in and of itself. That series also, I should note, it moves to Washington, D.C., to the Library of Congress in 1925, which kind of explains our concert series and this concert hall that she gave the funds for us to construct in 1925. But back to Pittsfield, back to 1918. One more special aspect of this festival was the Berkshire Prize. So along with programming concerts, she also established this prize whereby she would give $1,000 to an award-winning new original work for chamber ensemble. So in 1918, she said she had put out a call for new works, new string quartets, and 82 composers sent in music manuscripts for consideration by a jury. That was successful, so the next year in 1919, she actually announced this is going to be the year of the Viola Sonata, or the solo viola work, and 72 composers sent in music manuscripts that year. All under pseudonyms, I should say, so as to avoid bias. The judges, there was a panel of judges. There were 6 judges in 1919. For those of you who know a lot about the time, I'll just say who they were real quick. The judges that year were the violist Louis Bailey, pianist Harold Bauer, Richard Aldrich, who was the music critic for the New York Times, Frederick Stock, who was a composer and also the longtime conductor of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, oboist and founder of the Longy School of Music, George Longy, and Reuben Goldmark. He was a composer and a teacher. Today, we would know him best for having taught Aaron Copland and George Gershwin. So those 6 judges narrowed down the 72 manuscripts that came in to 2 finalists, and they were at a standstill in terms of deciding who would win. Those were Rebecca Clarke's Viola Sonata and Ernest Bloch's Viola Suite. Ernest Bloch, for those of you who don't know, he's a Swiss-born American composer. He was quite well established by 1919. People knew who Ernest Bloch was. So 3 judges favored Bloch, 3 favored Clarke, and nobody was budging. So ultimately, what did that mean? It meant that Mrs. Coolidge had to cast the deciding vote. And interestingly, I've read several articles and books by scholars who have had the opportunity to look at Rebecca Clarke's diaries, some more correspondence that I don't have access to in our collections. And it appears as though they probably opened the envelopes to see which composer, or who the composers were for these 2 manuscripts before Mrs. Coolidge made that deciding vote. So she actually was deciding between 2 composers, but also 2 friends. They were both friends of hers at the time. And also, after she decided that it would go to Bloch, I also read that she apparently went to Clarke's home personally, went to go see her in person to give her the news about what had happened, and then sent her a letter, expressing her condolences. And Clarke relayed this story in an interview later in her life, and she said, "Finally, Mrs. Coolidge broke the vote, and she said to me, 'And you should have seen their faces when they saw it was by a woman.'" So maybe she was there when they opened the envelopes to see who these 2 final composers were. I mentioned Frederick Stock, one of the judges, and he was the one who was a conductor at the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. He wrote a letter to Mrs. Coolidge after she broke the vote, sort of reflecting on the process of selection, and it's one of the letters that I've selected to put out. I'm just going to read kind of the most revealing paragraph that he includes in it. He says, quote, "Well, Ernest Bloch got away with the prize. We, you and I, at least, may reflect upon the outcome of the contest with one weeping and one laughing eye. The fact remains that Bloch has written a big work, one which I think will last. Personally, I feel sorry for Miss Clarke. Her sonata has much charm. The first movement is very fine, but the scherzo is so freakish and has no thematic substance of any consequence. The last movement is too rhapsodic. But just the same, she has very fine talent. What the wiseacres would have said had a woman composer and one of your personal friends in Pittsfield won the prize, I do not dare contemplate. But I am sure that suspicions of a frame-up between you and the judges would have been endless, and that we might have had a great deal of troubles besides. All things considered, we were most fortunate in our choice." Unquote. Nice. The interesting thing about this comment from Stock is that Mrs. Coolidge was just as connected to Ernest Bloch as he was to Rebecca Clarke. They were good friends, and she even was really responsible for him networking and finding his job at the Mann School of Music, and actually paid some of his salary. So for Stock to point out these, this would have just been drama-filled if you picked her. I'll just go on. So, needless to say, Mrs. Coolidge always ensured that there was an odd number of judges on the selection committee from then on. She was not about to put herself in that position again. And because, as I said, because she was close friends with both of them, it caused her a lot of anxiety having to make that choice. I mentioned that she personally reached out to Clarke to let her know what had happened and how sorry she was. And we have quite a lot of letters from Rebecca Clarke to Mrs. Coolidge in the Coolidge Foundation collection. And one of those letters, Clarke confides to Mrs. Coolidge and says, quote, "I want to tell you what an event in my life this festival was. As to the Bloch, I thought it was one of the finest things I have ever heard. And it was superlatively played. You've no idea how excited I felt when they started it. As far as my own place in the program goes, I would like to tell you that last Thursday was the most wonderful day I have ever had. I can never tell you what I felt, and through your competition this year, you have given me the greatest impetus to further work that anything possibly could, unquote. So I should have said, they did still play Clarke's piece on the program of that festival and indicate that it's second composition in the Berkshire Prize. And I have a copy of that program on the table as well. The New York Times reported on that festival and the concert, and specifically on Clarke's piece, and said, the piece reveals strong influences of the modern French school, and that the name Debussy comes to the listener's mind involuntarily. Miss Clarke has written with uncommon skill for the viola, an instrument which she plays herself, and has made use of its most ingratiating qualities, while her writing for the piano is also singularly effective. So you can see for yourself if you agree with the New York Times, if you would have voted. I think we should have had the Clarke piece and the Block piece, and then we could have had a vote. That would have been so good. Okay, well, but you know what? Since Block won then, let's let Clarke win today. And I think this would be a wonderful time to listen to the piece. I want to make a note, your program does not mention the fact that the piece actually includes 3 movements. The first movement is marked impetuoso, the second movement vivace, and the third movement is adagio allegro. So the last movement will start out slower and then ramp up. So that means also there will be 2 little pauses in there. Just let it go. Okay, and I will come back after the performance with just a few more words about Rebecca Clarke, what I pulled today. We'll do Q&A, but for now, please join me in welcoming Katherine Murdock and Audrey Andrist, who will perform Rebecca Clarke's almost award-winning Viola Sonata of 1919. submitted another composition to the 1921 Berkshire Prize. That was for piano trio, and wouldn't you know it, she came in second again. I know. So, okay, so then in 1923, 2 years after that, Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge actually commissioned, just flat out commissioned Clarke personally to write a new work, and that was her Rhapsody for cello and piano. This is really notable too because Rebecca Clarke is the only woman to be able to say that Mrs. Coolidge commissioned a work from her. There are no other women composers who were commissioned. However, the Rhapsody did not fare as well critically as the Viola Sonata and the piano trio that I mentioned. And her composition output really kind of starts dwindling after that, not that she stopped altogether. She returned to England in 1924 after spending some time in the States, and she focused on performing then and founded the English Ensemble, which was an all-woman piano quartet. During the summer of 1939, Clarke was in New York visiting her brothers who had moved there. That was the summer Britain declared war. London was being evacuated, so she decided to stay in New York and lived with her brothers, and had a little bit of a spark of new creative inspiration and wrote about 10 new works around that time. And then in 1944, on the streets of New York City, she was just walking around and happened to run into an old friend of hers named James Friskin. James Friskin was a pianist, and he was an original faculty member at the Juilliard School, and he actually was a classmate of hers at the Royal College of Music back in the days when she was studying with Stanford. So she ran into him in early 1944. They fell in love. They were both 58 years old, and by September of 1944, they got married. And so in the collection display, you'll note when you get a chance to come up here, I have the Viola Sonata manuscript on this table, along with some other things. I have the manuscript for her Rhapsody on that table. I also have her marriage announcement that she sent to Mrs. Coolidge with a sweet inscription that says, "We hope you approve." And I have the letter that Mrs. Coolidge wrote back to her expressing her great surprise at seeing the marriage announcement, which is very sweet. So just to give you a heads up about that. And Clarke composed little at all in her remaining decade. She lived to 1979. She was 93 years old, stayed in New York, and that is where I'm going to stop talking. I'd like to open it up for questions. If you have questions for me, I also wanted Audrey and Katherine to come back to the stage because I thought you might have questions out there from the performer's perspective about the work itself. And also I should say, if you have a question, raise your hand, I'll call on you, and then wait for a microphone to come to you because we're recording it for webcast, so we want to make sure your question gets on the recording. I see a hand back there, yes.
Thanks. I had a question for the musicians. I'm interested in the experience, particularly Ms. Murdock, about the range of the viola and the balance as a violist in duets with the piano, in terms of the balance of register, and how you see the viola in the repertoire of pieces compared to violin duets. I appreciate the quote that Cait read about Rebecca being directed to play the viola from the piano because she might have a better sense of how the pieces interact. And I'm interested in your experience as a violist about that.
Yes, absolutely. I will say, first of all, that I was always a violist. I did play violin for 1 week, and I just couldn't bear it. No, I do love the violin when well played, but in my hands it was not well played. In any case, I've always seen things from the inside. I think actually another sort of side story, I was influenced by my parents having a recording of William Primrose playing Harold in Italy on the viola. And if you know Harold in Italy, when they asked me if I wanted to play a second instrument, because at that time I played piano, they said, would you like a second instrument? I said, viola. I want to play that instrument. And if you know Harold in Italy, it's all in that middle register. I mean, it's crazy. 1834, Berlioz wrote this concerto for viola, well, quasi-concerto solo part within a large orchestral piece. And it's hard to play. I've played that. You really have to learn how to sink all your weight and all your projection and get the sound out because it's all middle. So this is one reason why many composers weren't sure of how to write for the viola, because the medium that was very common was either concerto or sonata to highlight an instrument. Well, nobody thought viola could stand up to that. So I don't know if Cait talked about anything about the sort of the blossoming at the early 20th century of viola music, but this is when, especially in the UK, Lionel Curtis began to play viola. He loved the instrument. He was a huge pioneer. And then Primrose, who had been a violin student of Isai, Isai switched to viola. He said, switch to viola, you'll be fantastic. And he was amazing. And Rebecca Clarke was a huge part of that because she was a really fine violist. And composers were starting to hear great proponents of the instrument. So they started writing music for the instrument. So yes, we have to work to project. And somebody like Audrey, she's experienced and she's sensitive and she knows how to adjust. There are pieces where composers might not quite understand the situation, and when I'm playing a new piece, sometimes I'll talk to the composer and say, should we put this up an octave or should we change the scoring? So that was a long answer to a short question. Yes.
Can we get the mic down for him? Sure, no problem.
In due time.
Hi. I was just curious. There was this competition between Bloch and Clarke. I wonder if they knew each other and if there was any kind of if they influenced each other in any way. Because I had the feeling in the piece that there was something that maybe Bloch would have written as well. So I'm just interested in if I'm off the wall or if I'm onto something.
I don't actually know if they knew each other at that time. I know Rebecca Clarke spoke very, very highly of Bloch, and there was just this sort of, with the World's Fair, was it 1917, the first World's Fair? I mean, there's awareness of other cultures and exposure, and suddenly travel became a little more possible, and people going to other countries, and Gamelon, and I mean, everything that Debussy, Ravel, all the Impressionists were influenced by. Rebecca Clarke was influenced by all of that, so, and as was Bloch.
Yes, I'm not aware that they were close friends, but she certainly knew who he was and was an admirer of him. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I'll get over to that side after this, I promise.
I'm curious how a competition works for composition. Do they judge just on the scores, or do they actually listen to excerpts or the entire piece before they come to their conclusions?
So my understanding of how the Berkshire Prize competition worked is that each jury member would get a copy of this, or would look at the score. Actually, probably wouldn't get a copy, would look at the score, and would study it individually, make a personal assessment, and rate it on a scale. And then those manuscripts that had achieved a certain score, they would come together and they hired, or not hired, but they assembled musicians who were particularly good at sight reading, who would then play the pieces for the jury. So it was both individual study with the score and getting to hear it, to make that decision.
I think that nowadays, modern composition competitions, of course, with all of the technology that composers have now, and if they make particularly good friends with good musicians, can often submit recordings, of course, of their pieces. Composers will often, Kathy and I both play a lot of new music. Composers often will send us what are called MIDI recordings, which are done on a computer, so that we can get a sense of the piece. I don't know about you, but I find this completely unhelpful because it's not musical. It's just a computer playing the notes. And usually I don't even listen to those MIDI recordings when they send them. I just wait until I can really delve into the piece myself.
Somebody on this side, I don't want to ignore this side. Maybe the woman in this, yes. Oh, Janet's coming to you.
I'm coming. Hi. I was wondering, given the viola's problems, projecting, why there was a mute called for in the middle of the last piece. And I was also curious how do you think this whole piece sort of plays to viola's strengths?
How it does what?
Plays to the instrument's strengths, the viola's?
Absolutely. Great question. She is a colorist. She was absolutely a colorist, and the mute is just another tool. You also heard Ponticello, a little bit of the tremolo Ponticello, the pizzicato, of course, harmonics. So it's this new world that's opening up. Again, all the impressionist composers are exploring this. So I think she adjusts. I mean, she knows the instrument intimately. And by the way, I did play on her viola one summer because a colleague of mine in New York happened to have the viola. Actually, he was looking to sell it. I don't know who has it now. I should check. But her viola was very dark, very complex, and I played on it up in Maine, in coastal Maine. It was not very happy. It became more and more complex to the point where it sort of, I felt like it was very hard to project on that. So I don't think she had a particularly loud viola, but she scores the piano appropriately. I think she thins it out, and as long as we're not exactly in the same range.
I think, I guess if I can defend the piano for a second too. I think that, as Kathy was saying, with her being a colorist, and some of the effects are mainly coloristic effects and not necessarily that you're supposed to always hear the viola more than the piano. Maybe the piano is more prominent sometimes.
Oh no, we're constantly in duet, and it'll be like viola, right hand, left hand, and then the harmony. So it's just that the piano is multiple players at once. And as to playing to the strengths of the viola, I think it does it wonderfully. She knows how to use the range. She knows how to use the register. Primrose used to say, the glory of the viola is the A string and the open strings and the harmonics. And that, she uses the A string when she wants bold and bright, and she writes in a lot of fingerings also. So.
It's a really fun piece to rehearse. We had a really great time putting it together.
Yeah.
Great. I have a question here.
With all the time that Clarke spent in her later years in the U.S., from 1944 to 79, what was her musical life like then? Did she perform? Did she meet any American composers? Did she reestablish any links with English musical life?
Her time in the States, I mean, so she did have that kind of a little spark of inspiration and got back to composing a little bit. But it really wound down by the early 1940s, not when she got married, but she actually took a job as a governess in Connecticut. And I think she was wanting some independence from she was living with her brothers and their wives, and I think that was, we all know how family can be, right? So she took that job, and if I had access to her diaries, Leanne Curtis runs the Rebecca Clarke Society, and I know she has done research and looking at her diaries and her letters that the estate still has. I think that those would relay a lot more information to us about that time and what was really going on. I don't know a whole lot more, although actually you might be able to speak to this because some students did spend a lot of time with her later in life.
Yeah, I have a pianist friend in New York, Diane Walsh, who went to Juilliard in 1969 and was the first boarder with Rebecca Clarke. This was after Friskin died. She lived with her for 2 years, and she became very good friends with her, and Clarke continued to have boarders after that, pianists, and she loved to listen to them practice. My friend Diane would be invited back to, there were, I guess, many gay parties, wonderful gatherings where she would talk about her freelancing years in the 20s and 30s in New York and all the great people she played with. She was riddled with arthritis. I guess she couldn't leave the apartment in her later years. So all that time that Diane knew her until she died, Diane did not know she was a composer. None of that time spent living with her for 2 years. So I think Clarke was, even though she was really a pioneer, she was remarkably modest and maybe didn't think enough of her skills and abilities.
Yes. From what I've read, there are other students who boarded with her or spent time with her who did come to learn that she had composed, and there was a little bit of sharing, amongst circles there. It really wasn't until the 1970s that people started, there was sort of this renaissance of interest in Rebecca Clarke. She was actually interviewed for a radio program that was in celebration of the pianist Myra Hess, and it was about celebrating Myra Hess and her career. And in the interview, because she knew Myra, the interviewer said, tell me these stories, and Rebecca said, oh, and there's this program that we played together, and we played some of my works, and he said, oh, you composed. And she said, I did, and he got kind of interested in her story, and then actually invited her back to feature her, an interview about her career and her life. And that's one of the moments where interest renewed in her. Was there one more hand? Maybe on this side, one more question we'll take.
I wanted to go back to something you touched on, which was kind of the duet feel to the music, which I thought was very remarkable. I did not anticipate that, and maybe I just haven't seen enough of these performances. Is that how it was written, or is that partly your interpretation? Because it seemed like it was very much a conversation to me, and back and forth with the theme and all.
Thanks to Audrey's fantastic voicing. Really, in piano, you have to separate the melody, the solo voice, and the harmony.
I like to tell my students that, whenever you're working on any piece of music, be it solo piano or chamber music, that you are an entire orchestra. But the problem is that you're making all the same sound. And so in order to bring out what you might imagine as the oboe melody in your part, you have to make it a very, very different sound, very distinct from the rest of what you're playing, and trying to just zero in on voicing. That's the word pianists use to describe that process of just figuring out what to bring out in pretty much every single bar. The very first piano lesson I had with a college level teacher was when I was in high school, and he agreed to take me on as a student, but he told me that I had to drop all of the repertoire that I was playing at the time and learn the Bach D minor 3-part invention. And I was very polite at the time, but I really thought that the Bach D minor 3-part invention was too easy for me. So I thought, well, I'll show him that I'm ready for harder music. So I went home and I learned the D minor 3-part invention in a week and memorized it and brought it back to my lesson, thinking, okay, I'll play this and we'll be done with it, and then we'll move on to something, you know, Beethoven sonata, something fancier. And we spent an hour on the first 4 bars of the piece with me learning how to voice. So that was a light bulb. It was like it was an amazing, it could have been really depressing, but it was actually a very inspiring moment for me in my training. So.
I was just sort of thinking while we were hearing from you, the musicians today, and the warm response you got after playing, one of the letters that I've put out on the far table is a letter that Rebecca Clarke wrote to Mrs. Coolidge, and she proposes, she says, I don't want to overstep any bounds here, but I know we were talking at one point about putting together a cello program, and I wondered if you would consider hiring a woman to play the cello. And she says, I think it's a great service to employ women on the stage when their talent is equal to or greater than men. So I just think how wonderful that we have 2 fantastic women musicians playing the work today on stage. Yeah. We will wrap up the Q&A now. I just have 3 more things to say before I release you to storm the stage. I am a reference librarian, so I cannot let these opportunities go by without referring you to other resources should you wish to learn more about Rebecca Clarke and this work or her other works. The first book I'd recommend is a Rebecca Clarke Reader. This is edited by Leanne Curtis, who I mentioned earlier, who runs the Rebecca Clarke Society. It's fantastic. It has a collection of essays from various scholars about Clarke. It has reprints of articles that Clarke wrote herself. And it has transcripts from interviews with Clarke towards the end of her life. So it's fascinating. There's a story about how she loves tarot cards, and she read Ravel's tarot cards at a party one night. That's my teaser. You have to go read the book to see what they say. The other book that about Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge, Cyrilla Barr wrote. She talks about the Clarke and Bloch, the tie, and her casting vote. Cyrilla Barr also wrote a really nice essay about Rebecca Clarke as well. The Viola Sonata, the music manuscript that's on the table, is fully digitized and available on the library's website for you to just check out, for you to research. So I have to make that plug. Again, I invite you to come up and look at the collection display. I will stay up on stage here, and I'm sure Katherine and Audrey are happy to hang around too and continue any conversations you might have, ask any questions you didn't get to ask before. And my last note is just thanks. My heart was warmed by what a great presence we had today, and I'm so grateful for everybody for coming out to learn a little bit about a new composer and hear a new work to them maybe. And thank you to Katherine and Audrey.